But in the early days, actually, what happened is the brands were largely a mark of assurance.
Yeah.
It had two roles. One was mark of assurance, and I remember when I joined advertising in the mid '80s, it was considered down market
Mm-hmm.
to sort of use Hindi in anything,
Oh
and
wow.
which is absurd, given the fact that in India, only a tiny fraction of people speak English.
Yep.
So if you look back on the last World Cup, which is where you see the largest assemblage of advertising in one
Yes.
place, the quality of advertising was pathetic. I mean, it was sad.
You've seen brands evolve, right, over the last 3 decades in various different ways. This entire concept of brand has transformed in many, many ways, right? So, do you want to share your perspective? What that transformation have you seen? What it was earlier and what it is now?
Yeah. No, so it's interesting. Brands have had a long history in India. They've been around for ages. In fact, you look at some of the multinational brands; they are over 100 years old. So I
Yep.
mean, that's so do brands do go back. But in the early days, actually, what happened is the brands were largely a mark of assurance.
Yeah.
It had two roles. One was mark of assurance. You had at the unorganized sector. We didn't. The quality was variable. So brands at a very basic, rudimentary level gave you the assurance of quality.
Yeah.
The other role that brand played, because of the fact that the consuming class was very, very small, so they became status signifiers. And if I go back, in time, the kind of advertising when say cigarettes advertising was allowed, or when you look at coffee,
Mm-hmm.
there was a small cocoon of very upper class people,
Yep.
living the good life. I mean, so a lot of advertising representations tended to be so either absolutely mainstream, talking to the mass sort of an audience, or this very rarefied little cocoon.
Mm-hmm.
That was what advertising tended to be,
Yeah.
but limited
Yeah.
because speaking to very few people. And I think and also it was very, very elitist in the sense that a lot of advertising was in English.
Mm-hmm.
Even for categories like biscuits and all, which were mass categories, you had advertising which was in English. And I remember when I joined advertising in the mid '80s, it was considered down market
Mm-hmm.
to sort of use Hindi in anything,
Oh
and which
wow.
which is absurd, given the fact that in India, only a tiny fraction of people speak English.
Yep.
The idea that your local language you thought of as being down market was just a sign of the kind, and also the kind of people who were in marketing, the people who were in advertising came from a small little sort of a class and
Yes.
community.
Yep.
I think so. That was then. Gradually, the market opened up. We started seeing also a lot of MBAs who come from, who actually, while being still privileged, come from a relatively larger, more, diverse group,
Yep.
came into the client side and therefore the brand side, and the consumers' voice started mattering a lot more. So
Yep.
brands became much more open to consumer voices. You had much more use of local languages across the country. You had brands that started looking and mining consumer emotions for insights. And so you had this whole, I think in the 90s, you had this whole regional language and local language revolution,
Yeah.
where a different kind of people came into the business and created a completely different kind of a brand. So I think that was what happened then. Over the years, then of course we've had the influx of technology,
Mm-hmm.
which has made a big difference in the way brands are conceived, in the way marketing is practiced.
Yep.
Today, for instance, the way marketing is practiced is completely different. There is much more data, there is much more science at one end, and on the other hand, there continues to be a lot of sort of focus on the consumer, because change is so rapid
Yep.
and so dizzyingly fast that I think to keep track of changing consumers is quite challenging.
Yeah.
So you have now, of course, the new phenomenon is of the D2C brands,
Yep.
where you have the direct. So they have a whole new class because of the fact that there is market access that is easy, there is
Mm-hmm.
media access that is easy. Everyone can, anyone can get on the net and
Yeah. Start a
sort
company.
of start a company,
Yeah.
right? And it's not necessarily cheap, but it's easy.
Yeah.
So I think you have a whole new category of creators who have come in uh, across the board, but certainly also in the brand space, who are creating brands that they want to
Mm-hmm.
buy.
Yeah.
So it's much more personal. They are much more targeted at much smaller and more clear kind of niches, and we are seeing therefore this whole phenomenon, and they're funded because there is of the availability of capital, and this new kind of a funding ecosystem allows that to happen.
Mm-hmm.
So I think we are seeing a completely new kind of a brand that is being created. It has its challenges and ups and downs, but it is a new universe there. So I think over the last 40 odd years or thereabouts that I have been in the business, there have been changes across the board in several different ways.
No, and I would love to pick each era, and I'm sure this will take 4 hours to just pick each era out. But I want to talk about some of the pivotal moments which have happened. Right, you spoke about 90s, and one of the other big infusion which happened was cable TVs, which never existed. I still remember, there was one TV amongst a community, and people would come together to watch that one TV, and Doordarshan was the only channel. But then with the advent of Z in India and a lot of other channels coming about at the same time, which brought a lot of regional content to bear, which was not accessible to many of us. Now, but when you think about TV as a medium, which has unfortunately lost its path over the years, right? Uh, how do you feel today marketers are looking at the linear format, which is called, uh, are looking at advertisement in that space, right? And you've seen that transformation in the last 4 decades in a big way. Uh, and linear TV has lost its interest. Do you think is that right statement?
I think that is largely correct. I mean, you can nuance it, but it's largely correct.
Hmm.
I think what you've seen, television when it came was like this explosion that happened,
Yeah,
right, in our lives, both in terms of entertainment when cable television came,
yeah,
and in terms of advertising. Along with it, and it changed so many things.
yeah.
It made local languages that much more accessible. It changed storytelling,
Hmm.
which became much more inclusive, much more fun. In fact, some of the, if you look at go back to the 90s and the and the knots, you will find that some of the most entertaining bits on television were the
Oh
advertising.
yes.
I mean, there was a time when advertising was really was and people discussed advertising avidly because it was so entertaining.
Hmm.
So I think that was a time when television created the whole cult of the celebrity. So television did a lot of things, right? Now over a period of time, what has happened is, of course, because of the linear format, and has faced challenges. One is from technology,
Hmm.
because you come which is just much more geared to the individual now.
Yeah,
Every individual has their own personal way of consuming media. They're, so everyone is a different kind of an animal when it comes to consuming media. They
yeah,
have access which is personal and individual.
yeah,
So I think that changes and fragments the idea of having Hum Log or something with 90% viewership is, or a Mahabharat with 90% viewership, cannot even be imagined today. The
yeah,
best you can do is a World Cup or something,
yeah,
but even that is a relatively a very small proportion of India. So I think so. Media is part of it. Technology, of course, leading that change. The other is also, I think, in some ways, people have, and creation
hmm,
has moved from formal creative producers
yeah,
like the advertising agencies.
yeah,
Today, you find creation is now a cottage industry.
yeah,
Everyone has access to the internet, and
yeah,
if you look at some of the reels in an earlier time, TikTok videos,
yeah,
the YouTube videos, the kind of creativity that we see, that is a is teeming, I mean, yeah, across the country. And the primary source of creative energy in India has, even in the commercial space, even in the small sort of video space, the has moved completely from the advertising industry
hmm,
to these independent creators. So advertising has lost energy. So if you look back on the last World Cup, which is where you see the largest assemblage of advertising in one
yes,
place, the quality of advertising was pathetic. I mean, it was sad.
yeah,
And I think that part of the problem. So part of the problem is on the supply side, the media.
yeah,
The ecosystem has changed and fragmented, and therefore there's very little television can do. Just because it doesn't cater to
yeah,
people's needs in the same way as OTT, etc. does. But the other part is also that in terms of creators, the energy and the creative energy that used to animate the industry has is nowhere near the same.
yeah. Why do you think so? That's the case. Why do you think the creative space is becoming so bad? I would say it's not even creative anymore, right?
Yeah.
Why is that becoming that scenario? And it's not just India phenomena; it's becoming a global phenomena as
Global
well.
phenomenon. I think there are several factors that go into it. One is, I think there is a drain. There is some sort of a drain that has happened of talent.
Hmm.
So it's just more lucrative to be in the OTT space or be independent creators and make have the independence and freedom and still make money. Cinema has changed. It is now open to new forms and new modes of storytelling that are much more suitable for urban sort of creators
Yeah,
to become part of that community. So I think that is one source of loss. The other is the fact that I think the business also has become, much more commercially driven.
Mm-hmm.
It's much more, it's a commercially driven, and b, it is internationally controlled.
Yeah.
So therefore what you have is an an enormous kind of focus on profitability
Mm-hmm.
at the cost of creativity very often. And the agencies have, also because of the fact that the business has fragmented so much, with so many specialist skills being available,
Yeah.
with digital becoming, and has taken so much of the money away, that you also find that from the business itself has become far more complicated and far more revenue and profit driven. And therefore I think that is part of the pressure that a lot of the creative industry feels,
Yeah.
when they, as against an earlier time when there was much more room
Mm-hmm.
that was available to invest in talent, to invest in, and where brands also were much more willing
Yeah.
to experiment. Now experimentation happens on the digital side.
I hope you enjoyed this clip from my podcast series called Masters Decoded. The intention of bringing these clips to you is to allow you to understand some key moments of the conversations I've had with my guest. I would recommend and highly encourage you to listen to the entire podcast, which you can find the link to the podcast in the description below. I look forward to you subscribing to my channel and hit the bell icon so that you can be notified of all the future clips which we keep releasing every week on this channel.